We're going to talk about the spiritual elements of dying today, because that is something that I think might have been the biggest aha moment for me throughout this whole journey. I'm of the generation that looked at death as pretty much something that other people took care of. And my experience with my mother showed me that that was far from the truth. It's obvious that death affects everything. It affects our finances, it affects our relationships, it affects our social schedules, because death actually removes us from all of those relationships. But for me, after this experience with my mother, what I have found that if anything, death is spiritual. And so dying 100 years ago used to be considered an experience when those who were dying were closest to God, however that person defined God. So when someone was dying, family and friends would gather around the bed where the dying person lay to hear stories, because they felt that those who were dying had this closer connection to God at the moment. And so we don't do that now if we let strangers be the last people that our dying loved ones see. And we're missing out on an amazing opportunity. So what I discovered through my research is that the dying need to have an opportunity to be reconciled to their God. And in this transition period, when they are sort of like half in and half out of these worlds, the real world and then a more spiritual world, they are actually seeing and conversing with people who are no longer alive. And that in some cases, families will experience what they're calling supernatural events after their loved one has died. So I'm going to talk about a few of those experiences. I had one person that I interviewed tell me a really heartbreaking story about visiting her dad and taking care of her dad on one day when she brought her 2 dogs with her. And it was her turn to take care of her dad, and she let her 2 dogs out in their yard, and the dogs escaped, and they ran across the street, and one of them got hit by a car and killed. But a week later, when she came back, when it was her turn again to care for her father, she didn't have her remaining dog with her. But her father seemed to think that she had brought the dog who had passed away. So he was so excited to see this dog and was mentioning for her to try to help the dog come up, because the dog had been a smaller dog. He wanted her to lift up the dog, and so she pretended that she was lifting up this dog. And can you imagine her heartbreak, missing her dog and then having her father go through this kind of strange situation? But that's what she did. And her father proceeded to pet an imaginary dog and was so happy that she had brought this dog to visit. So that was the first interview I had done, and the first interview where I had heard about such a spiritual experience. I had another person tell me that a person that she was caring for had been in a coma for days. And then all of a sudden one morning he woke up and asked for a cup of coffee. And he said he needed to be able to get everything ready. He needed to find out where his motorcycle jacket was, because they were heading out at noon the next day. And so this woman, who was a professional healthcare provider, she tried to, what I would say, play along and try to respect this person's comments and try to ask if there was anything else this person needed to get ready for this trip. And she called the family later and said, well, your beloved is making these plans, and they all came to the hospice ready to help this person go on this trip. And they said, oh yeah, we know. He's probably talking about his friend who had died a few years earlier in a motorcycle accident, and let's just do what he wants. So the man had his cup of coffee, and he had, I think, a little piece of bakery, and then he fell back asleep. And the next day, he died at 1:12. And my own experience was that this room filled with golden light. And since that time, when I experienced that, I have had other experiences. So I want to share a personal one of mine. My mother died in the month of June. And on the day I found out that my mother was terminal, I also found out that my beloved dog Sammy was dying of cancer. So I actually had my driver's license photo taken on that day because I wanted proof that I could handle the bad news like that in one day and still be able to follow directions, still be able to smile, and still be able to sign my name to something. And I actually wanted a document, a formal legal document that represented that strength that I had. So my mother died in June, and Sammy was actually with me the day she died. And 6 months later, my dog was getting much sicker. On Christmas Eve morning, I had to put my beloved dog to sleep, and I was really crushed that day because I thought God was playing a horrible joke on me. It was my first Christmas Eve without my mother, and also the first Christmas without my dog. So the next year, then, I'm working on this dissertation on death and dying and still not having a whole lot of fun, but I did manage to get myself a new dog. And that dog actually helped to heal the hole in my heart from losing my mother and my other dog. So Christmas came around again, and it was Christmas Eve. I went to church by myself, and I came home, was a little melancholy because not only was I a little lonely, worshiping in church isn't always the easiest, but I also felt like in my heart I didn't really have a lot of joy. I hadn't put up much Christmas decorations, and even though the neighborhoods were filled with light, I wasn't really appreciating them as much as I should. So when I came home, my husband was just sort of watching television, and my son was reading a book in his own room, and I still felt a little bit alone. So I sort of made the interesting plan to read the book, The Polar Express, out loud to my dog Felix. Eventually realizing how pathetic that was and being a little embarrassed about how I was being so sad, I decided I would take my dog out for a walk. And I'm really glad I did, because it had snowed since I had gotten home, and it was one of those really soft, fluffy snow globe kind of snows. And so as I was outside, I gradually was able to reclaim my sense of joy in the season, but also I would say my sense of joy in life in general. I had lost that during the time when I was writing about death, and certainly during the time when I was caring about my mother and my dog. So I was happy to be able to reclaim that. And all of a sudden I heard a sound that sounded like an aluminum can being kicked down the road. And there was a gust of wind that happened all of a sudden, and my dog Felix and I were standing in our driveway listening to this sound, and all of a sudden at my feet, this ornament landed. And it does not escape my attention that the word on this ornament is joy, and it's written on both sides. And it still has the price tag on it from Target. And it was in excellent condition. So at first I didn't know where this came from. But it really took me only a few moments to understand that this in itself was a gift. It was a spiritually related gift to me, reminding me that there's a season for everything. And there's a season for birth and a season for death. And the season for death should not take away my joy or anyone else's joy. So for me, there was a huge spiritual component in the dying experience of my mother, and I will never take anyone else's death for granted. Whether they die of chronic disease, or whether they die quickly from a car accident or from a pandemic, I will always honor that last moment of whoever had that last breath. And I will try to honor their story. And throughout the process, I will try to remember that joy is really needed in everything we do. So spirituality is very much a component of dying. And I hope that you're able to have the courage to seek that in your own experience or that of those you love. Thanks.